The prison went quiet all at once. No trays clanged. No forks scraped. In a place built on noise and orders, hundreds of men in gray chose silence. It was the summer morning when Pelican Bay refused breakfast. Not just one housing unit. Not just one yard. All across the blocks, men put their hands on their knees and stared at untouched food. A note slid under a steel door, "No more dying in the dark." The officers looked at each other. The warden stood still. Phones began to ring, inside the prison and at the state office far away. After years of fights, stabbings, lockdowns, and fear, the men were choosing a new kind of battle: hunger. Outside, reporters waited. Inside, one question grew louder than the sirens. Would this standoff force change, or would someone collapse before anyone listened? To understand why that quiet moment mattered, we have to go back. In the early 1990s, Pelican Bay State Prison in California was new and already famous for the wrong reasons. It was set between tall trees and cold fog, near the Oregon line, designed to stop gangs from running things. The prison had a place called the SHU, Security Housing Unit, where men lived alone in small concrete cells, almost always by themselves for almost all day. The lights were bright. The doors were thick. The air felt like winter even in summer. People said the SHU was for the worst of the worst, but many who landed there said they were held not for crimes in the yard but for what the prison believed about their group ties. Back then, the yard could explode fast. A look, a whisper, or a rumor could turn into a fight. Officers in helmets rushed in. Pepper spray filled the air. Rubber blocks hit the ground. Sirens screamed. A fight in one pod meant lockdown in many others. No visits, no calls, no yard. For weeks, men stared at walls and waited. Anger built. Fear built. And when doors opened again, it sometimes broke into another fight. The cycle felt endless. People on the outside heard riot and imagined monsters. People on the inside heard riot and thought, another day that could end in blood. Then something new happened. A federal courtroom far to the south began to look closely at Pelican Bay. In public reports, doctors and human rights workers wrote about untreated pain, about men with mental illness caged alone, about beatings and bad medical care. Lawyers brought lawsuits with names that sounded like storms. One judge wrote that some practices were cruel and had to stop. Words like excessive force and mental health care were no longer just complaints in letters. They were findings in a court order. The prison had to change some rules. But inside the SHU, many men still sat alone, unsure when they would see the sun without a metal grate cutting it into tiny squares. Years passed. Some rules got better on paper. On the tier, it didn't always feel that way. If you were validated as part of a prison gang, you could be stuck in the SHU for years, maybe decades, unless you debriefed, which meant telling officials things about your group and your friends. To many men, that felt like signing a danger note on your own back. So they stayed quiet. They marked time in the tiniest ways. One more push-up, one more letter, one more tally mark in a crack. They watched men grow thin. They watched men talk to the air. The idea grew. If fighting just brought more lockdowns, maybe a different kind of action could bring light. In the early 2010s, in small whispers through vents, in letters that cleared the mail room, men inside Pelican Bay began to plan something that did not look like a fight at all. No fists. No weapons. Only bodies and the choice not to eat. Words moved from cell to cell. We will starve before we let the old system starve our hope. They wrote 5 simple demands about fair rules, group punishment, and the long, lonely days. They asked for an end to endless solitary unless someone had done something violent, not simply because of a label. They asked for warmth, literally and figuratively. A calendar was set. The date came. That morning, the one we began with, officers rolled carts and lifted lids. Steam rose. Men turned away. When lunch came, it was the same. By dinner, the news had reached the street. Family members stood with signs. Former prisoners spoke into microphones. A mother in Los Angeles said, "My son is a person, not a number." A retired officer in Crescent City said, "We need safety, but we need sanity too." The story hit TV. People who had never heard of Pelican Bay now knew the name and the gray blocks and the word SHU. Inside, the first days were foggy with adrenaline. Hunger pinched but pride held. Men tapped on their walls in slow codes, counting together. Day 3. Day 5. Nurses came by with clipboards and cups of water. Some men's hands shook. Others wrote letters with lines that wavered like waves. An old-timer in D Block told a younger man, "This is not about making them fear us. It's about making them see us." The younger man said nothing, saving strength, saving words. The officers kept working, steady and tired. Some stood at the doors and said, "Eat." Some said nothing at all. On the outside, lawyers pushed papers again, but differently this time. The hunger strike was not a riot the state could shut down with shields. It was a spotlight. A new lawsuit argued that holding people forever in the SHU based on labels was unfair. Reporters asked state leaders direct questions. How long can you keep a person alone? The answer had to be more than a shrug. Two lawmakers drove to the prison and walked through the cold hallways. The air smelled like disinfectant and metal. A lawmaker whispered to another, "It's like a ship built to never see the ocean." They met men through thick glass and listened to quiet voices. They met officers who said, "We do what we can with what we have." Days stretched. Small wins arrived. A promise to review some cases faster, a pilot program for more yard time, talk about ending indeterminate SHU time unless someone actually broke a rule with violence. But promises are paper and paper can burn. The men kept going. "Not yet," they told each other. "Hold." Some who were not in the SHU joined too to show unity. The hunger strike spread to other prisons. It was not just Pelican Bay anymore. It was a map of empty trays across California. The lows came like waves against rock. One man felt dizzy and fell off his concrete bunk. Another had a heart that beat like a drum, too fast then too slow. Nurses moved quickly. Officers called out codes. An ambulance rolled through the gates. For a few hours the strike felt like it might break apart in fear. But then letters arrived from churches, from teachers, from people who had never known anyone in prison. "We see you," they wrote. "We care." A group of retired judges signed a public letter asking the state to rethink the rules. A former prisoner did a TV interview and cried on camera. "I still sleep with the light on," he said. "I need people to know what that place does to your head." The highs came too. A big newspaper ran a front-page story. A TV documentary showed the gray yards and the tiny dog-run pens where men exercised alone. A state official said in a press conference, "We hear the concerns." Behind the scenes, meetings buzzed. Could the state end forever SHU time for gang labels alone? Could they create new units where people had programs, classes, and a path out of the SHU? Could they keep officers safe while also treating people humanely? The questions were hard, but now they were being asked out loud. On day 20, the fog outside the prison was thin, and the sun looked like a coin behind glass. Inside, an officer with 20 years on the job stopped at a door and said softly, "Hang in there." It was not approval. It was not scorn. It was just a human voice in a hard place. The man inside nodded once. He had lost weight. His cheekbones looked sharp. He thought of his mother's voice, his daughter's laugh, and a yard with real sky. Then came the extreme moment that would push everything forward, or snap it in two. On day 25, as medical staff took blood pressure checks up and down the tier, a man in the middle pod swayed and crumpled. His head hit the concrete with a crack that echoed. Officers shouted. A nurse ran. The door clanked, the kind of heavy metal sound that turns your stomach. Down the hall, other men stood, pressing palms to the slot in their doors. The ambulance lights threw red and blue across gray walls. At the same time, a guard hurried in with a sealed envelope from Sacramento. News from the state office, news that could change everything, or nothing. The stretcher wheels squeaked. The radios crackled. The envelope shook in the warden's hand. Was this the moment when California would promise real reform, ending endless solitary for labels alone and opening a path out of the SHU? Or would the state hold the line and let the strike break on the rocks of time and policy? The warden slid a finger under the seal as the ambulance doors slammed, and the yard fell quiet again, waiting to hear what would happen next. The warden's hand trembled slightly as he tore open the envelope. Around him, radios buzzed, officers moved fast, and the air was thick with something that wasn't quite panic but wasn't calm either. The letter was short, too short for what it meant. The state was ordering immediate medical intervention for all striking inmates, but also promised a review of long-term isolation practices. It was both a threat and a promise in one sheet of paper. As the ambulance carrying the unconscious man rolled out of Pelican Bay's gates, everyone inside knew the line had been crossed. No one could pretend the hunger strike was just noise anymore. It had become a test of California's soul. News broke fast. Helicopters hovered over Crescent City. Reporters crowded outside the fences, their microphones catching the cold wind. Families cried on live television, holding pictures of sons they hadn't hugged in years. The governor's office released a careful statement. The Department of Corrections is assessing the situation. Inside the SHU, men whispered the words like a prayer, assessing. No one knew what that really meant. To the inmates, it meant maybe Just maybe, someone was finally listening. Days passed. The strike didn't stop. More men fell ill. Nurses walked cell to cell with 4 bags asking, "Will you eat now?" Some said no, too weak to lift their heads. Others nodded, not out of surrender but to stay alive long enough to see if change would really come. The warden ordered lights dimmed at night to calm the blocks. Officers spoke in low voices. Even the air felt different, thicker with tension and something else, something like hope trying to grow in concrete. In Sacramento, lawyers from both sides gathered. The case that would later be known as Ashker versus Governor of California started taking shape. The inmates' lawyers argued that endless solitary confinement wasn't just punishment, it was torture. They brought photos of windowless cells, letters written in shaky hands, and expert doctors who spoke about minds unraveling in silence. The state's lawyers countered that isolation was needed to stop gang violence, to keep officers safe, to prevent chaos. The room was quiet as one of the lawyers read a letter from a man who had spent over 20 years in the SHU. "I forgot the sound of rain. I forgot my own reflection. I dream of color." Meanwhile, inside Pelican Bay, some officers began to see things differently. A sergeant with a shaved head who'd worked there since the 1990s riots told a rookie, "When I started, I thought this was war. Now I think it's a loop that keeps eating itself." The rookie nodded, unsure what to say. He'd joined the job to make a difference, but the gray walls were starting to blur days together. Weeks after the letter from Sacramento arrived, something finally shifted. The hunger strike ended, not in defeat, but in exhaustion and uneasy compromise. State officials promised to review solitary policies. They sent inspection teams, psychologists, and new supervisors. The men were told their cases would be re-evaluated, that those without violent records might move to new step-down units where they could earn their way back to general population. But everyone knew words could fade. So while some ate again, others kept quiet watch. For the first time in decades, doors that hadn't opened began to slide apart. A handful of men stepped into brighter yards, not the open fields of freedom, but fenced spaces where they could talk to others, stretch their legs under real sun. It was small, but in Pelican Bay, small things mattered. One man said, "I can smell pine trees again." Another looked up and said, "I forgot the sky had clouds." But reform wasn't easy. Many officers distrusted it, fearing gang violence would return. They tightened searches, doubled counts, and reminded the inmates, "One fight and it's all over." Some prisoners distrusted it too, thinking the program was a trick to break unity. The air between guards and inmates was fragile, like a glass bridge. Every step mattered. Then, just when it seemed like things might hold, the system cracked again. A rumor spread, someone in a step-down unit had attacked an officer. No one knew the full story yet, but word moved faster than truth. Lockdown alarms blared through the prison. Lights flashed red in the corridors. Doors slammed shut. The reform that had taken months to build now stood on a knife's edge. In one of the new units, a man who had spent half his life in solitary pressed his forehead to the cool steel door. He whispered, "Don't let this be the end." Down the tier, boots pounded, radios screamed, and the sound of a struggle echoed. The same fog that once rolled over Pelican Bay returned, heavy and cold, wrapping the prison in silence again. Outside, reporters spoke of progress. Inside, the walls told another story, one of men caught between riot and reform, between punishment and change. And as one officer shouted, "Code Blue," from the far end of the block, no one knew if Pelican Bay was finally breaking free of its past, or falling right back into it.